As an investigative and narrative journalist, I've spent decades following people whose stories society considers finished. Among them, a man on Florida's death row since 1976, begging for DNA testing of his evidence. A father trying to figure out how his son went blind and deaf inside of a county jail. A couple agonizing over how their mentally ill son died of a head injury inside of a psychiatric hospital. As I investigated the dark shadows of our justice system, I noticed that injustices often endured despite exposure in newspaper stories, in state reports, and even generating outcry from the public. Again and again, I saw the same pattern. Vulnerable people were harmed, those time elapsed, and those responsible were shielded from accountability. I realized that injustice survives because time makes us stop looking. Someone deciding to look again may be the only exposure something gets. In my case, exposure comes from investigative and narrative reporting. It brings hidden harm back into view. It makes people care. And when nobody is held responsible, the truth becomes justice. 16 years ago, I sat at a stainless steel table in a prison cafeteria waiting for a man named Tommy Ziegler. All around me, murderers, 24 of them in orange jumpsuits, sitting at their tables with their families. Some stood in line for a frozen burger. Others posed in front of a mural of a meadow with an eagle while an inmate took Polaroids for $2. They call this the Death Row Cafe. A retired budget analyst named Ray McEachern had asked me here to meet Ziegler, who at this point had been sitting in his cell awaiting execution for 34 years. A jury had convicted him of killing his wife, in-laws, and another man at his family's furniture store in Winter Garden, Florida on Christmas Eve, 1975. Ziegler always said that he walked in on a burglary and he was shot in the stomach. But prosecutors said he shot himself and he staged the whole thing for a life insurance payout on his wife. Now, McEachern had never met Ziegler before he went to prison, but McEachern's brother had actually arrested him back in 1975, and he'd always had doubts about Ziegler's guilt. So, when McEachern retired, he began looking at the case, he studied it, and he decided Ziegler had been framed. He put up $25,000 for a reward for information on the case. He went to the state capitol on his scooter, and he protested, hoping to draw attention from lawmakers. This is the Polaroid that I got the day that I was there, the two of them in front of the meadow and the eagle. I asked McEachern how he could be so sure Ziegler was innocent. He told me that Ziegler had been a hard-working man, 30 years old, never convicted of a crime. 6 months before the murders, he'd taken over the Ziegler furniture store because his father had a stroke. He had no need for money, McEachern said, and McEachern couldn't figure out how he shot himself in the stomach. And then he said something that made me think. He said, nobody was looking at this case anymore, and if he didn't, nobody would. He thought my readers should know that this was an innocent man. At that point, Ziegler showed up. He was tall and skinny, all angles, except for his head, which was bald and shiny as a doorknob. He told me that he'd been fighting his conviction for so long, he no longer felt that he would ever get off death row alive. To be honest, I was having a hard time persuading my editors that it was a story worth pursuing. But it intrigued me that McEachern was so invested in Ziegler's case, in his complicated case. During the trial deliberations, a juror had a nervous breakdown. She said the other jurors were pressuring her. The judge, behind everybody's back, ordered her doctor to give her Valium, a tranquilizer, otherwise known as benzodiazepam. Later, an hour later, she voted to convict. A week later, she still thought he was innocent, but she said she couldn't take the pressure anymore. But still, the conviction remained. Ziegler's lawyers discovered important witness statements and police reports, including evidence of a burglary across the street from the furniture store on the night of the murders, had not been turned over by prosecutors. But still the conviction remained. Ziegler's lawyers tried to get his evidence tested for DNA. At their own expense, prosecutors refused 6 times. If you want to understand how a system operates, you have to look at what happens when nobody's watching. In 2018, I started to wonder whether other death row inmates were not getting DNA testing. So I put together a podcast on Ziegler's case called Blood and Truth, an 11-part podcast for the Tampa Bay Times. And in it, I reported that in 3 out of 4 cases, DNA testing was being denied, even though Florida had passed a law 2 decades before allowing the testing. Writing these kinds of stories, I realized that hidden harm is actually pretty common. While reporting about a young man arrested for carjacking who went into the county jail and went blind and deaf inside the county jail, I learned that the jail itself had had years and years of complaints about its medical care. The jail released the young man from the jail without any explanation. He moved into the back of his dad's bail bond office. His dad communicated with him by writing letters one at a time on his hand. The story showed how doctors and nurses had neglected his growing medical care, his growing medical problems. These are stories about consequences. They talk about how and why, and they call for accountability. But these are not easy people to root for. Their identities have been replaced with labels: criminal, drug abuser, mentally ill. It's easy to look away when someone has a label. Journalism asks us to look again. While reporting on stories about the Florida psychiatric hospitals, the stories that earned my 2 colleagues and I the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting in 2016, we found a frightening scene where violence had doubled to 1,000 incidents. Patients were dying, employees were being injured, and our reporting found that the state had cut $100 million from the hospital's budget in that same time frame. Lawmakers pumped millions of dollars into state psychiatric hospitals and into Florida mental health care, and they made changes to the hospitals as a result of our stories. Last year, I reported on a Florida reform school in the Panhandle, where boys as young as 9 were beaten, raped, and forced to fight each other so that caretakers could bet on the outcome. My stories showed that 34 of those boys ended up on death row, at least 34 ended up on death row. Brain experts told me that the abuse that was suffered in here would have had life-altering, in the reform school, would have had life-altering impacts on these boys. But nobody was ever held responsible for the violence at this reform school. In Ziegler's case, his file moved to from prosecutor to prosecutor, each of them fighting his every move to prove his innocence. In 2015, a hearing was held on whether or not to grant him DNA testing. And a judge took 18 months to say no. Just one small example of why this case has taken so long. But science had progressed, and it was time, and Ziegler's evidence still had not been put through the testing. So in 2022, a prosecutor ran for office, and she agreed to let him test his evidence. And those tests showed that Ziegler had no blood from any of his relatives on his shirt or his pants. Experts said that would have been impossible if he had killed all 3 of his family members. In December, a judge held a hearing, and Ziegler showed up. He was frail and sunken in his wheelchair with an oxygen tank. He's 80 years old now. His lawyers got up and said that he was innocent, that the DNA evidence proved he was innocent, and that the judge should set aside his conviction. Lawyers for the state got up and said, no, he's still guilty, and they pointed to a spot of blood on his shoe from that night, as well as witness statements from people who saw him with some of the victims before the murders. Last month, the judge ruled that that the conviction would not be set aside. Though she didn't explain how he got through that whole night without getting any blood on his clothes. Ziegler's lawyers have appealed. In December, Ziegler will have been on death row for 50 years. His story, and that of the others, shows us that when we decide a story is over, injustice doesn't disappear. It stays until it waits until someone else comes along and takes another look. Thank you.